Hello there. Can everyone hear? Outstanding. Well, I'd like to begin this afternoon by applauding your moral courage in showing up for this session, because I know at the level of kind of popular stereotypes that the whole business of PR has a sort of slightly sleazy reputation, doesn't it? Normally people hear PR and they think it's a polite way of talking about lying. There's a sort of old joke that captures this notion. There's a psychologist who wants to understand the thinking of different professions. And so she invites in a mathematician, and she says to the math guy, "What's 2 plus 2? And the math guy says, "Well, obviously, always and everywhere, it's 4. Okay, fine. Then she brings in a economist, and she says to the economist, "What's 2 plus 2? And the economist says, "Well, it'll depend on 2 and 2 of what? I mean, if we're talking about dollars, you have to discount for inflation and deflation over time, but the average answer is going to be 4. Okay, fine. Then she brings in a PR guru, and she says to the PR guy, "What's 2 plus 2? The PR guy gets up, walks across the room, shuts the door, comes back, pulls his chair up very close to this woman and whispers, "Why? What do you want it to be?" Okay. And, this is, of course, what people often think of when they think about PR. We talk about spin, we talk about messaging, and people think it's about sort of manipulating the truth in a kind of dishonest fashion. But, of course, at its best, what the enterprise of public relations is supposed to be about is about giving the truth the best opportunity to be heard in a Wild West marketplace of competing voices. Okay? And that is the spirit in which we're going to be talking about public relations with regard to the Pope here today. Now, it probably will come as no news to anyone in this room that the Vatican does have what I think most people would consider to be a fairly serious problem with the enterprise of PR in the sense in which I've just given it. That is, they often struggle to get good news about the Pope and the Catholic Church out into that marketplace of competing voices. This slide gives you just different sort of signs that there is a problem. You've got a quote from the Washington Post, another from a couple of very well-known Italian journalists who have done a whole book on this subject. My personal favorite comes from my friend and colleague, George Weigel, the biographer of John Paul II, who back during the John Paul years was once asked, "Has the Vatican's communications operation finally entered the 20th century?" To which his answer was, "Yeah, the first half of the 20th century." So I think we can all agree that there are occasionally difficulties on this score, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But first, before getting into the bad news, I want to give you 3 caveats that I think, things I want to read into the record about church communications and communications on behalf of the Holy See. First, obviously, not everything in the world can be reduced to a problem of PR. Okay? There are times when the Holy See is going to say things that some people simply don't want to hear, and no amount of messaging, no amount of spin is going to make that medicine go down any easier. It is also true that the Catholic Church is not in the business of selling soap, and some degree of detachment for concern for things like branding and Q ratings is probably a spiritually healthy thing. Second, not every difficulty of communications is the fault of the Vatican. We could easily have an entire session devoted to the media's problem when it comes to reporting on the Catholic Church, which occasionally takes the form of conscious and explicit anti-Catholic bias. I think more often it is simply the product of religious illiteracy and difficulties in understanding what the Church is doing or saying. But in any event, that is by way of saying that the relationship between the Church and the media is a two-way street, and when there are problems, it is rarely the case that only one party is exclusively at fault. Certainly, I don't think that the Vatican's communications woes can be laid directly at the feet of the Vatican press office and the Vatican spokesperson, Jesuit Father Federico Lombardi, who, in my humble view, does heroic work under very difficult circumstances. And third, not everything has failed. There have been a number of truly impressive success stories when it comes to getting the Pope's message out or the Holy See's message out. You see on the slide the cover of the Holy Father's book on the Gospels, which was an international bestseller and played to pretty good reviews in most circles. And, of course, the slide of his trip last year to the United Kingdom, which, against all expectations, was a sort of home run for the Holy Father from a PR point of view. And we're going to pick that trip apart in a few moments. But the point here simply is that this isn't an unmitigated sort of disaster zone. There are actually things that have gone very well. That said, the thesis I want to give you is that there is a chronic problem with communications in the Vatican with echoes at other levels of the Church, which makes it more difficult to tell the full story about either the Pope or the Church in our time, and which represents a serious obstacle to the idea of a new evangelization, a new way of taking the good news into the marketplace of the modern world. Now, the pictures on the slide capture sort of images of those difficulties. They are kind of symbols of moments when things have gone wrong. The picture at the guy with the Roman collar, this is Bishop Richard Williamson, the Holocaust-denying traditionalist bishop whose excommunication was lifted a couple of years ago, which caused a kind of global cause celeb. The picture in the middle, I suppose, speaks for itself. It's a symbol of the sexual abuse crisis and the difficulties with getting a more positive narrative about how the Church has responded to that. The picture on the other end of the slide, however, I'm presuming is probably not familiar to many people in this room, but it is, in my opinion, the best single sort of symbol, the best single representation of this chronic problem of communications I'm talking about. The guy wearing the glasses there on my right is an Italian journalist by the name of Dino Boffo. Dino Boffo was, up until very recently, the editor of the official newspaper of the Italian Bishops' Conference, a newspaper called L'Avvenire, which is Italian for the future. Official newspaper of the Italian bishops. He had to resign a year and a half ago in the middle of what was, in Italy, the equivalent of Watergate or Enron. I know this was not a big story here. This was huge. Every day, front page news. It was the subject talked about on talk shows and on the AM radio waves and everywhere for basically a full month. What happened is this. An Italian newspaper carried a piece which purported to be based on official documents from the Italian magistratura, that's the police, indicating that Boffo was a notorious homosexual who had harassed an Italian woman via cell phone because he wanted to carry on some kind of affair with her fiancé. Okay, that was the story. Now, when it came out, Boffo vigorously denied it, but because of the scandal, he was forced to step down. What emerged a week later was that this document was a complete fake. Okay, somebody had put it together on Photoshop. It was not, in fact, a police document. It had been confabulated on someone's computer and then kind of anonymously leaked to various news outlets. Once that became clear, the hunt was then on for who was the culprit, okay, who had caused all of this. And the popular theory that emerged in the Italian media, okay, and I'm telling you, this was, it is surreal and impossible to believe, but nevertheless, this was the reconstruction of events that was rolled out in every newspaper and broadcast outlet in Italy, is that it had been the Cardinal Secretary of State, cardinal by the name in Italian, by the name of Tarcisio Bertone, who didn't like Boffo because Boffo had a different line on Italy's government than Bertone did, so the theory goes. And Bertone wanted to get rid of him, so he contacted the editor of the Vatican newspaper, an Italian layman by the name of Gian Maria Vian, who put together this fake police document. And, so the theory runs, Vian then gave it to the head of the Vatican Security Services, a guy by the name of Domenico Gianni, who then leaked it to various media outlets. So think about what was being proposed here. Okay, the notion was that the #2 official in the Vatican power structure, the second most powerful man in the Church, after the Pope himself, the editor of the official Vatican newspaper, and the man charged with the Pope's personal security were somehow in on this plot to defame Boffo. And again, I cannot stress what a huge deal this was in the Italian media marketplace. Believe it or not, there is now a verb in Italian, to boffo someone, okay, meaning to sort of bring them down with some sort of nefarious plot. Now, as I say, on the surface of it, it was ridiculous. However, this story metastasized for 18 full days from the first time a newspaper floated this notion to the first public comment on it from the Holy See. It was 18 full days. And you all know that in the marketplace, most people think silence signifies consent, right? The fact the Vatican did not say anything about this, the takeaway in the street was it must therefore be true. So after 18 days, when the Vatican finally did issue a denial that any of this was true, most people didn't buy it. My favorite expression of that was the banner headline in an Italian newspaper called Il Manifesto. And when I say banner headline, you would have thought this was the bombing of Pearl Harbor, okay, in terms of the play this got. The banner headline was, Il Vaticano nega tutto nessuno ci crede, which means the Vatican denies everything, no one believes it. Okay? My point is the inability to knock down a story that just on the surface of it never passed the smell test of being even possibly true. Because the truth is, folks, if the Cardinal Secretary of State wanted to get rid of the editor of the Italian bishop's newspaper, he has much easier ways to go about it. Okay, all he has to do is pick up the phone. Okay, so even if you don't want to believe, which I do, because I know these people, I know Bertone, and I know Vian, and I know Johnny, I know they're men of integrity, I know they would never be involved in anything like this, but even if you don't want to believe that, I'm saying just at the level of plausibility it was always ridiculous, and yet through an inability to engage this story successfully, the Vatican allowed it to metastasize and become something that even reasonable people thought must be true. All right, all of that by way of saying there clearly is a problem here. Now, what I want to do in terms of thinking our way through this problem and what might be done about it is to give you 3 case studies. That is, I want to give you 2 examples of Vatican communications where things went horribly wrong and try to learn some lessons from the debris of those episodes, and then give you 1 example of where things went exceptionally well and also try to learn the lessons of that experience as well. And then we'll end with some global thoughts about what all this means for the enterprise of church communications. Okay? Our first case study involves Benedict XVI's March 2009 trip to Africa. The Holy Father visited Cameroon and Angola on that trip. And this is especially topical because the Pope is getting set to go to Africa again. November 18th to the 20th, he will be in Benin, small African nation in West Africa. And one hopes that the Vatican manages the communications of that trip a little bit more successfully than they did this one. All right? Now, to understand what went wrong, first we need to ask, what was the Pope trying to accomplish by going to Africa 2 years ago? These were the 4 stated aims of the Africa trip. First, he wanted to present the working document for a Synod of Africa, that is a gathering of about 300 bishops, principally from Africa, but also other parts of the world, who were going to meet in the Vatican the next year to advise the Pope about strategy for Africa. So that was aim number 1. 2, he wanted to put a spotlight on the growth and dynamism of the Catholic Church in Africa. Because, folks, this is the spot par excellence on the Catholic map where the faith is growing the most rapidly. Consider this. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 1.9 million Catholics in sub-Saharan Africa. At the end of the 20th century, there were 139 million. That is a growth rate of 6,708%. I don't care what line of work you're in. If you've got an almost 7,000% growth rate, you know that ain't bad. Okay? So they also wanted to put a spotlight on just the amazing dynamism and energy of the Catholic community in Africa. Third, the Holy Father wanted to support the efforts of the local bishops and local church at social change, particularly around issues of corruption, which tends to be the #1 social justice priority of Catholic leaders in Africa. And most basically, he wanted to tell a good news story about Africa. You know, the problem with coverage of Africa in the Western media is that typically Africa makes news only when people are killing each other or they're dying of hunger, right? Those tend to be the only 2 stories that the Western media will report about Africa. Anything positive usually flies below the radar screen. That was the agenda for the trip. Now, is that the story that actually came out of the trip? Alas, no, because instead what we got was the great condoms debate of 2009. You may remember that aboard the papal plane en route to Cameroon, and I was there, journalists asked the Holy Father for his opinion about the role of condoms in anti-AIDS efforts. This was his answer. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. I put it up here simply to make the point that the only thing that got reported was that soundbite in the middle. The problem cannot be overcome by the distribution of condoms. On the contrary, they increase it. Okay? Now, the context of all of that got left out. And actually, if you read the whole answer in its context, it's a much more sort of sophisticated and nuanced treatment of the issue than that isolated soundbite might make it seem. But nevertheless, that soundbite was reported by the Western media. They banged it like a cheap drum. It made the rounds of the world. And in Europe and the United States, it caused an enormous degree of blowback and controversy. In fact, 2 things happened in Europe that are absolutely unprecedented. The Parliament of Belgium, okay, formerly Catholic Belgium, voted to censure the Pope. The first time any European parliament has actually taken a formal vote to criticize a papal statement. And secondly, and I think even cheekier, the government of Socialist Prime Minister José Luis Zapatero Rodriguez in Spain announced that in protest of the Pope's comments, they were sending 1 million condoms to Africa, helpfully carrying labels called Benedict condoms. Okay? My point is that this became the only storyline out of the Africa trip. It blotted everything else out of the sky. So all of that other stuff the Pope wanted to communicate and spotlight got lost, particularly in the way the trip was reported here. I will tell you from personal experience, having covered 50 trips of John Paul II and 15 of Benedict XVI, I have never, ever seen a trip where the contrast between what people on the ground experienced and the way the trip was reported in Europe and the States was as night and day as this trip was. And of course, looking back, the truth of it all is the Vatican should have known that. Okay, they should have known that if Benedict wades into the debate over condoms and AIDS in this kind of fashion, it is inevitably going to be the lone headline of the trip. It's going to dominate media discussion and coverage, and everything else is going to get lost. So, in that light, oh, and one other point I want to make is that because of that great fracas around what the Pope said, there were 4 other points about about the Pope's comments that came only way too late in the news cycle to really make any difference in terms of people's perceptions. Point 1, whatever you think of what Benedict said, whether you agree with it or not, I will tell you that it is a position that is widely shared by most African bishops. I have probably interviewed 100 bishops from various parts of Africa on this point over the years. Almost to a person, they would all say the same thing. If you ask them about condoms and AIDS, the typical African bishop will say 2 things. One, he will say that the condoms that arrive here in Africa often don't work. They are made of cheap materials. They sit on docks for 6 months, 9 months, a year before they're distributed. They break. They often do more harm than good. And secondly, they will tell you that if you give a condom to a male, particularly a guy who has not been to university, levels of literacy aren't that high and so forth, often he will think of it as a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card that protects him from harm and induces him to commit even riskier behaviors than he otherwise would have. I'm telling you, African bishops will say that in their cultural context, condoms cannot be the cornerstone of anti-AIDS efforts. Now, you can agree with that or not, but this was not a case of an isolated octogenarian European just popping off. This was a case of a pope giving voice to what bishops from Africa have been telling him for the last 20 years. Okay? Second, this is a position that is widely shared by other religious leaders in Africa. And again, I can attest to this from my own personal experience, because after this condoms debate erupted, just by happenstance, I was scheduled to have an interview with the imam of the National Mosque in Yaoundé, which is the capital of Cameroon. And I asked him, what did he make of what Benedict said about condoms? And the imam's response, this is the leader of the Islamic community in Cameroon, his response is, my only regret is that he didn't wait to say this until he got here, so we could have said it together. Third, there is empirical evidence, of course, and a lot of it, that suggests that anti-AIDS efforts that rely principally on condoms don't work as well as other kinds of efforts. We know that in sub-Saharan Africa, those nations that have had most success in bringing down infection rates are those that have adopted an ABC program, abstinence, be faithful, and then condoms. Whereas those nations that have have underlined principally the distribution of condoms have had less success. You have to change culture rather than just handing out condoms. And that is a point upon which secular AIDS experts in Africa also agree. Again, I know this from personal experience because they weren't hard to find. As a matter of fact, one afternoon in Cameroon, as this story was making its way around news wires around the world, I actually popped into a grocery store merely to get a bottle of water. And as I was waiting in line to check out, I met a woman who introduced herself to me, told me that she asked what I was doing. I said I was there to cover the Pope's visit. She told me that she was a physician who treated AIDS patients in a clinic in the heart of downtown Yaoundé. And from her personal experience of treating these people, she would say that the Pope was absolutely right. Now, again, it's a debatable point. All I'm saying is that this was not simply an isolated figure taking a position that was out of touch with social realities. Instead, he was saying something that lots of people on the ground would agree with. Now, in light of that, what would a better strategy for the Africa trip have looked like? I would suggest it would involve these 4 points. First, it was a mistake to make condoms the first note of the trip, the first thing out of the Pope's mouth. You know that once that becomes the storyline, it is going to dwarf everything else. So I think it would have been a better strategy instead to build to a major speech on AIDS at some point during the Pope's itinerary. Obviously, the Holy Father can't go to Africa and avoid this question, but I think when it came up on the plane, the smarter thing to say would have been something like the following. We know this is an important question, and the Pope is going to address it in a major speech on Wednesday. But for today, day 1, we want the focus to be on good news out of Africa. Because had that been the line, then the day 1 coverage would have been closer to the Pope's actual objectives. Secondly, when the Pope gave that speech, I think it would have been smart to have other religious leaders like the Imam join him to make the point this isn't an isolated Catholic position. You could have had secular AIDS experts on the dais also, and again, they would not have been hard to find. And then finally, the Vatican could have prepared background materials to make the point that there is empirical confirmation for the point the Pope wanted to make. Unfortunately, the way it worked out was that we had to wait 72 hours until the Washington Post carried an op-ed piece from Edward Green, who's a physician at Harvard, who is the world's leading expert on anti-AIDS strategies in Africa, who said that the Pope basically had it right. Programs that rely principally on condoms have had less success than other kinds of efforts. My point is, all of this could have been orchestrated in advance so that a more sort of comprehensive and sophisticated understanding of what the Pope was trying to say could have been achieved, and you could have avoided blotting out other storylines out of the sky. All right. Second example, the Williamson affair, the Holocaust-denying bishop. This, of course, is the traditionalist bishop who, in late 2008, gave an interview to Swedish television which made the rounds of the world, the soundbite from which was what you see on the slide. I believe the historical evidence is hugely against 6 million Jews having been gassed in gas chambers as a deliberate policy of Adolf Hitler. What makes this a Vatican story, of course, is that at the very same time this story was making the rounds of the world, news broke that the Holy Father had made the decision to lift the excommunications that date from 1988 of Williamson and 3 other traditionalist bishops. So, of course, the headline was, Pope rehabilitates Holocaust denier, right? Just to refresh your memory, in case you didn't follow the bouncing ball, this is the timeline of the Williamson affair, and I'm not going to bother stepping through all of it. The point I want to make is that it was abundantly clear to everyone who had eyes to see, as of January 20th, that the Williamson interview on the Holocaust was going to be a problem. And yet the Vatican did not issue any statement about it until February 4th, 15 full days later. Now, that statement that finally came out, it hit all the right notes. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But this is another example of how a negative storyline begins to metastasize in the marketplace, and there is a complete vacuum of response from the Holy See in engaging it. Now, let's concede some points. First of all, let's concede that neither Pope Benedict nor other senior Vatican officials knew Williamson's history on the Holocaust before making this decision. And it's true. I know it may be hard to believe, but it's true. The reason it's hard to believe, by the way, is that this interview with Swedish television was not the first time that Williamson has spoken publicly questioning the historicity of the Holocaust. In fact, he gave a very highly public speech in Toronto in 1989 and basically had to hop a cab and get to the airport and beat a path out of Canada before he was indicted under that country's hate speech statutes. And all of this was easily available on Google. I mean, it doesn't require, hours and hours in secret archives to find all this material. So I know it is hard to believe, and yet it is the fact that until this situation exploded, the Pope and his most senior aides were not aware of Williamson's history on this issue. And second, in themselves, the motives for lifting the excommunications of these 4 traditionalist bishops were quite noble. the Holy Father was trying to heal the only formal schism to follow the Second Vatican Council, that is, the schism of the Traditional Society of St. Pius X. And of course, every pope sees it as part of his mission to try to foster unity and heal schism where possible. And secondly, what the Vatican was really doing here, rather than endorsing Williamson's extreme views, what they were actually trying to do is nudge the traditionalists gently to the center. The idea here was that we're going to have more leverage to address issues like the attitudes of traditionalist Catholics on interreligious dialogue and ecumenism and the Second Vatican Council. We'll have more leverage to engage them on all of that if they're on the inside rather than being on the outside. Put differently, the Vatican saw this as the beginning of a process of reconciliation, not the end. Okay? Now, all of that was communicated in the February 4th statement issued by the Secretary of State. It was a splendid statement addressing all of the questions that needed to be answered. Unfortunately, it came 15 days after the fact, and you all know the dynamics of the modern media. If you put out a statement 15 days after a story erupted, you might as well not have bothered, because by that point, people's impressions have already been set in cement. So what would a better strategy have looked like? First, here's a good tip for all of you. Before you're going to do something publicly, Google it. You know, find out if you're going to make a decision about some particular person or entity in the church, before you sort of align yourselves with them publicly, or before you make a decision affecting them, do a little basic research about what the history there might be to see if there are going to be difficulties. Secondly, make sure the right people are involved in crafting the decision. Remember that timeline I showed you? This story about Williamson's comments on the Holocaust broke January 20th. On January 22nd, the senior brain trust of the Holy See assembled to discuss how to present this decision to the outside world. Unfortunately, two key people were not in the room. Cardinal Walter Kasper, who at the time was the Vatican's top official for relations with Jews, and Father Federico Lombardi, who was the Vatican spokesperson, therefore responsible for relations with the media. In other words, the two obvious figures who should have been in the mix in terms of trying to chart a strategy to present all of this weren't there. And as a result, very important voices in the conversation were missing. And then finally, third, and I think this is the point, give your explanation in advance. If you know that you are about to do something or say something that is going to generate controversy, and people who are paying attention know when that is about to happen, don't wait until 15 days after the bomb goes off, okay? Give the explanation in advance so that the truth about what you're up to has a fighting chance of being heard in what is certain to be a kind of wide-open contest of people trying to spin this one way or the other. Now, let's at least do one happy story, one good news story. And this is the Holy Father's trip last year to the United Kingdom. Now, you may remember in advance, there were widespread predictions of gloom and doom about this trip. People were saying Benedict is walking into a very, very tough room. Okay, constructed not only, or based not only on the fact that there is a centuries-long history of anti-Catholicism in the United Kingdom. I mean, this is a nation in some ways whose very identity was forged in the repudiation of papal authority. Okay, so there's that. There is also the fact that the United Kingdom is one of the most thoroughly secular societies on the face of the earth, in which many of the moral teachings of the Catholic Church are a tough sell. And, of course, there was the damage to the Holy Father's image created by the sexual abuse crisis. I mean, in advance to this trip, just to tell you how bad some people thought things might go, there were a couple of high-profile atheists and human rights lawyers in the United Kingdom who were actually proposing that handcuffs ought to be slapped on the Pope when he stepped off the papal plane. Okay, those were the expectations in advance. And, in fact, instead, the trip was, in many ways, an enormous triumph. Every bit of polling data after the fact indicated that people's impressions of the Pope and the Catholic Church were significantly improved by the experience of this 4-day trip. Okay? Now, I want to stipulate two things before we talk about what went right. One, that in a way, Benedict benefited from low expectations. I mean, if people had felt going in the trip was supposed to be a triumph, their standards would be different. But given the fact that people had predicted the apocalypse, the fact that that didn't happen I think meant that most people thought it went better than expected. And secondly, you should not underestimate the degree of blowback that the trip did produce. There was an anti-papal demonstration in the heart of downtown London that drew about 10,000 people, which was the largest anti-papal demonstration of modern times. There was, during John Paul's 26 years and his 104 foreign journeys, during Benedict's 16 other foreign trips, we've never seen a crowd that large deciding to show up to protest the Pope's message. So I don't want to underestimate the degree of opposition. That said, nevertheless, all indications are that for the typical sort of person in the street out there in the United Kingdom, the perception was that things went exceptionally well. I think the kind of the symbolic moment that crystallized the fact that people felt the trip had been a success was when Benedict was at the airport in Birmingham getting ready to aboard his Alitalia jet to return to Ciampino Airport in Rome. Prime Minister David Cameron said this to the Pope. He said, "Holy Father, you forced us to sit up and listen." The kind of key point moment, the watershed moment of the trip, I think, was this. Was Benedict's address at Westminster Hall, which and the resonance of that, you have to bear in mind, he was standing in the very spot where in 1535 St. Thomas More was condemned to death for his refusal to renounce his loyalty to the Pope. And in that spot, Benedict addressed a cross-section of British secular intellectuals and politicians and movers and shakers in society, an extremely secular milieu. He gave them a deeply thoughtful presentation about reason, faith, and the role of religion in a pluralistic secular society that left them absolutely dazzled. And again, I can confirm that from personal experience because I was standing outside the hall with a colleague of mine who is a British journalist. And as we were standing there after the speech broke up, a couple of Cambridge intellectuals, one was an economist and the other was a social scientist, came out, and my friend knew them. And he walked up to these two guys who, believe me, do not have a Catholic bone in their body, okay? And my friend asked them, "What did you make of it?" And the one Cambridge Don said, "That was bloody brilliant." Okay, bloody brilliant. Now, in fairness, he went on to say that he was in some ways comparing this to the kind of public rhetoric they were hearing from Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. So, I mean, the bar was kind of down here. But nevertheless, I think most people would concede that he got through. He got through. What worked? Okay, why did the UK trip go right when so many other Vatican efforts to communicate have gone wrong? I think at least these, sorry, I'm going backward. At least these were the keys to success. First, the Pope by no means ducked the hard questions people had coming into the trip. He offered a direct apology for the sexual abuse crisis, as of course he did in 2008 when he came to the United States. He had his 5th meeting with victims of sexual abuse. He's now had 6 because he also did this during his recent trip to Germany. He had his first meeting with child protection workers to try to talk about what the church is trying to do in terms of abuse detection and prevention and to promote child welfare. The takeaway for the typical English person was that the Pope had actually engaged the questions that they had. He didn't come and try to pretend that everything is fine. Second, and I think most fundamentally, in his public messages, the Pope put the accent on what I talk about as his affirmative orthodoxy. That is, what the church says yes to, not what the church says no to, what the church supports, not what the church opposes. That was the scarlet thread that ran through his 15 public speeches in the UK, and it left people with a much better, and I think better rounded impression of what the church's message actually is. The core message of the UK trip that Benedict offered was that in a pluralistic and tolerant culture, doesn't religion, don't people of faith, deserve a place at the public table? And phrased that way, it was almost an impossible argument for people to refute. Okay? Now, I think another key to success is that the Pope had help. There was an enterprise put together by a couple of Catholic laymen in the UK called Catholic Voices. And the idea was that these guys knew months ahead of the papal trip, when the dates were first announced, they knew that for 4 days the Catholic Church was going to be in an intense media spotlight in the UK. So their idea was to put together a cross-section of 20 and 30-something-year-old Catholics drawn from a wide variety of walks of life, give them a crash course in the hot-button issues about the church and also in media literacy, and then turn them loose so that they could become the faces and voices of Catholic England during the time that the Pope was in town. By the way, the two creators of this initiative, just to demonstrate how seriously committed they were to trying to include all the different Catholic voices in this, the two founders were the English spokesperson for Opus Dei and a former managing editor of The Tablet, which is the kind of journal of left-wing Catholic opinion in the UK. I mean, in church politics in England, this is like matter and antimatter, okay? But these two guys, nevertheless, they're very good friends personally, and they pooled their resources to try to put this project together. And as I say, at last count, these Catholic Voices people did something like 4,000 different media interviews during the 4 days the Pope was in town. That's 1,000 a day. And on BBC, on Sky, and all the newspapers, they were the consistent voice narrating what Catholics in the UK thought and felt and what they made of the Pope's presence. And my proof that it worked is this. On Benedict's last day in the UK, he went to Birmingham to beatify Cardinal John Henry Newman. Now, as it happened, I couldn't go to Birmingham because I had to be sort of strapped into a seat on the CNN International studio in London doing the color commentary. And at the end of this, when we were done, when the Mass ended, actually after the Pope's homily, so the Mass was still going on, but CNN checked out at that point, the producer suggested that we go to a little pub around the corner to try to, get a pint and celebrate a job well done. And I said, great. So we went there. I was at the bar. Immediately next to me were two kind of just, vintage, stereotypically Cockney young British guys who, utterly irreligious, utterly secular. They were in the bar because an hour later the Manchester City soccer match was going to be on, and that's what they were waiting for. But at this moment, Sky TV was still on above the bar, and so they were listening to a couple of these Catholic Voices people talk about what their faith meant to them. And one of these guys turned to the other and said, "Oi, maybe that Catholic lot isn't so bleeding crazy after all." To me, that was a win for the home team, right? That, somehow an image of normality and sanity and wholesomeness in all of that just sort of came through. Okay? And the secret to the success was that we didn't rely solely on the church's official communicators to get the job done. We also empowered some very bright, talented, able, articulate young laity to carry the ball. All right? What are the overall conclusions we can draw? Well, one, I would suggest, as a basic rule of thumb, it is a good idea to see the train wreck coming. Okay? That is, if you know something is about to happen, which is likely to be a cause célèbre, okay, game up to respond to it before the fact rather than after. And a related point, defuse the bomb before it goes off. That is, if you know you're going to have to explain this to the outside world, do your explanations in advance, not after the fact. Third, enlist the help of those in the know. That's the lesson of the Catholic Voices Project. Believe me, when it comes to church communications, there is a vast pool of talented, competent, professionally experienced and seasoned laity out there who would love to have the opportunity to offer their gifts in the service of the church. Figure out ways to tap into that reservoir of expertise and competence and turn it loose. And then finally, most importantly, I think, emphasize the Catholic yes. Ladies and gentlemen, if I had the opportunity to print a line of T-shirts for church communicators and hand them out to everyone who even theoretically might one day be in a position to say something publicly on behalf of the Catholic Church, the lines on that T-shirt would be drawn from this comment of Pope Benedict XVI in September 2006 in an interview with German television. German TV said, Holy Father, most people think the church is just a finger-wagging scold. What do you have to say to that? And this was his answer. He said, Christianity, Catholicism, is not a collection of prohibitions. It's a positive option. It's very important that we look at it again because this idea has almost completely disappeared today. We've heard so much about what is not allowed that now it's time to say we have a positive idea to offer. Okay? Accent on the positive. What do we say yes to, not what we say no to? What do we support, not what do we oppose? Okay? I want to leave you with one final thought. I've given you 4 rules of thumb for a positive experience of church communications. I want to offer you one more quality that I think needs to be in the mix. And that quality is a sense of humor. I think if the outside world can see us with the ability to laugh at ourselves, can see us with the ability to sort of poke fun at ourselves and try to, that will take the edge off public impressions often of what the church is trying to say or do. And the good news here, ladies and gentlemen, is that you can find a sense of humor even in the most unexpected places in the Catholic Church. And I'm going to end with one last story to drive that point home. The book you see on the slide is a book I published in 2005, immediately after the election of Pope Benedict XVI, obviously called The Rise of Benedict. You all know that when there's a major global news event, right, what follows that news event, as surely as night follows day, is there's going to be a cottage industry in the publishing world of people trying to cash in on the celebrity. Well, this was my entry in the post-conclave sweepstakes, okay? Now, there is a tradition in the Vatican Press Corps that when one of us writes a book about the Holy Father, we always inscribe a copy to him, and then we give it either to his private secretary or to his spokesperson. And so, when this book appeared, you know, the conclave happened in April 2005. Benedict is elected on April 19th on the 4th ballot. I go off in May, write the book. It comes out June 1st. So when the book comes out on June 1st, I dutifully inscribed a copy to Benedict XVI, and I gave it to his spokesperson, who at the time was still the Spanish layman Joaquin Navarro Valls. Now, to be honest with you, it had never entered my mind for a moment that the Pope actually reads these books. Okay? I mean, in my imagination, I had pictured a box in the basement of the Apostolic Palace where these things gather dust, you know? So I gave the book to Navarro Valls, and then my wife and I came back to the States for vacation a little bit later, because this is now August. So August 2005, I am out visiting my 97-year-old grandmother in Hill City, Kansas, little western Kansas hamlet, which, by the way, is my candidate for the worst place name in America, because there is no hill and there sure as hell is no city. Okay? But in any event, there we are in Graham County, America. And my phone goes off, and you know how on your cell phones you can tell who's calling, right? So, you know, I could tell it was Joaquin Navarro Valls on the other end of the line. It was morning in Hill City, which means it was evening. The Pope was actually at this time on vacation. Benedict XVI has adopted the custom that he takes his summer vacation, usually in August, and he goes up to some village in the Italian Alps, you know, up there on the border with Switzerland. By the way, as a footnote, one of the curious things about Benedict's summer vacations is that no matter what Italian village he ends up in, somehow the Salesians always seem to own a gorgeous chalet there that they make available to it. So my tip for you, those of you who have Salesian friends, you know, try to get in on their timeshare deals, because it really would be worth doing. But in any event, they're up there. This is Val d'Aosta, August 2005. And Navarro is on the phone, and so I answer the phone, and he says, well, John, I wanted to tell you that I am here with the Holy Father on vacation, and he came down to breakfast this morning with your book in his hands, and he asked me to deliver to you the following message. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've just been told that the Pope has a personal reaction to something you've either written or said about him, I would want to be sure that your tray table is in a full upright and locked position, you know, because the skies might get a little bumpy. But I said, well, of course, Joaquin, I'm thrilled. You know, please tell me what the Holy Father had to say. Now, to get this, you need to understand, this book was divided into 3 parts, okay? The first third of the book was the final days of John Paul II. The middle third was the inside story of how Cardinal Ratzinger had been elected Benedict XVI. And then the final third was my predictions as to where his papacy was going to go. Okay? So Joaquin says, the Holy Father's message is the following. Please thank Herr Dr. Allen for having written this book, particularly the last third about the future of my papacy, because it has saved me the trouble of thinking about it for myself. Okay? I like to think he was kidding, huh? Point, ladies and gentlemen, is this. that is a model for the rest of us. You know, when we need to engage the outside world, whether it's engaged in the media or engaging in any other slice of life, I think if we can anticipate problems before they happen, if we can give our explanations in advance, if we can emphasize the positive value the church is trying to uphold, and if in doing all of that, we can also project a sense of humor, that to me is a winning strategy for church communications every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Okay? Thank you and God bless you. Now, we've got about 10 minutes before the end of the session, so I am happy to take questions. Let me tell you that you can ask questions about anything you heard in the presentation, but don't feel restricted to that. If there's something else that's on your mind, by all means. For example, if you've always wanted to know, is it true that Benedict XVI prefers orange Fanta to red wine with dinner? Yes, that is true. Okay, so, you know, whatever bit of Vatican curiosity is on your mind is fair game. The other warning I need to tell you is that I'm getting paid to be here for the next 10 minutes whether there are questions or not. So if you don't ask questions, I am simply going to stand here and tell you more Pope jokes. Okay? Not a consummation devoutly to be wished, believe me. So what's on your minds? Yes, ma'am. I'll come down and so I can repeat your question. Go ahead.
How did you get engaged in this job? I don't know.
Okay, so the question is about me. The least interesting thing we're going to talk about today, I promise you. But the question is, how did I get this job of covering the Vatican and the Pope, I presume? Backed into it. Here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. In the English language, the number of full-time Vatican correspondents when we are at full strength is maybe 10. Statistically, you have a much better chance of playing in the NBA than you do getting one of these jobs. Everybody I know backed into it. Okay, for example, the U.S. bishops have their own news agency. It's called the Catholic News Service, and CNS has 3 full-time correspondents that cover the Vatican. The guy who was their bureau chief, in other words, the #1 guy for CNS, he came over to Rome as the correspondent of Wine and Cigar magazine. That's how he got to Rome. And it turned out then there was an opening at CNS at one point, and him being Catholic decided that sounded like a hoot, you know? In my case, I was studying to get a doctoral degree in Scripture. I ended up moving into journalism as a way to sort of pay the bills. Ended up getting seduced by it, thought this was really cool, and so I started writing about the Catholic Church. And before very long, I was hired by the National Catholic Reporter. They were looking for a Rome correspondent. This is the mid-1990s, because like every other media outlet in America, they thought John Paul was going to drop dead any day, right? He proceeded to live another decade, right? I mean, the number of Vaticanisti whom John Paul outlived, I mean, you could plant a forest with these guys. But in any event, you know, they didn't want to be caught unprepared. So they were looking for someone in Rome. They had me in the mix. They asked me if I would be interested in going over to Rome. And, you know, when you write about the Catholic Church, in my opinion, this is like if you play minor league baseball and somebody asks you, would you be interested in playing in Yankee Stadium, right? I mean, the obvious answer to that question is yes, and when can I get there? And so it just sort of went, in other words, it was dumb luck. I mean, I would love to tell you that this is the result of some kind of crafty advanced planning on my part, but no. I mean, it was just, I sort of stumbled into one thing after another. So that's either luck or providence, depending on what theological filter you want to apply. But there it is. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. Okay, so the question is, how is the Pope's health? Well, to give you the only empirically certain answer I can, the answer would be we don't know. Because, you know, the Holy Father, unlike the President of the United States, does not take an annual physical, the results of which are released to the press. Okay, so we don't have any solid way of answering that. All I can give you is kind of anecdotal impressions. The anecdotal impression would be that the Holy Father's health is fine. You may know, some of you who pay attention to these things may know, that on October 16th, for the first time, the Vatican announced that when the Pope is doing liturgies in St. Peter's Square, he is no longer going to walk the liturgy, but he's now taking that rolling platform that John Paul II used for his final years. But this is not because there is any kind of health crisis. Think about what this means. I've actually walked it off. If you go into St. Peter's Square, the distance from the sacristy where the Pope vests to the back of the church, all the way up the central aisle and to the main altar is more than 100 yards, which means that every time the Pope celebrated a liturgy, he had to walk the equivalent of more than 2 football fields wearing heavy liturgical garb, and the guy is 84 years old. quite honestly, given the choice, I'd take the platform too, you know? No, and look, I mean, I obviously covered the twilight of the John Paul years. I have a sense of what it feels like when the people around the Holy Father are worried about his health. And I will tell you, I get none of that vibe now. On the contrary, the vibe I get is that all systems are go. The soundbite version of that answer, ladies and gentlemen, is German machinery is built to last. All right, I think we have time for at least one more. Yes, ma'am.
Your predictions on his papacy, have they been false?
The question is, my predictions on his papacy, that last third of the book I told you about, how close have I been? First of all, let me confess something to you. Do not take me seriously as a prognosticator, okay? Even though I got a whole book called The Future Church. I'm telling you, you want to read that for what it says about today, not tomorrow, because my track record as a prognosticator, in 1999, I published a biography of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the last chapter of which contained 5 reasons why he would never be Pope. Okay? A point that the Holy Father and his aides have found occasion to remind me of on diverse occasions. That's the big picture. Now, actually, having said that, I think the predictions in the last third of that book largely have held up, with one towering exception. I said basically 3 things about the papacy of Benedict XVI, or 4 things, rather. One, I said that he's going to be a teaching pope rather than a governing pope. Okay, I think that has largely held up. Second, I said that the struggle against what he had defined before the conclave as the dictatorship of relativism in the West, that is, the effort to try to put faith and reason back in conversation with one another, that would be the centerpiece of his teaching. Okay? And it has been. I mean, if you want to read what I consider to be a 4-volume papal masterpiece about the relationship between faith and reason, here are the 4 texts to look at. His speech in Regensburg in September 2006. Now, of course, that was another communications debacle, because you remember there was an opening quote in that speech about Muhammad and violence, which created difficulties and Christian-Muslim difficulties. But if you can get beyond those 12 words and read the actual 5,000-word speech, it's masterful. So you've got the Regensburg speech in 2008. You've got the speech he gave in Paris at the Collège des Bernardines in 2008. You've got the Westminster Hall address in 2010, and the speech he gave to the German Bundestag 2 weeks ago. You put those 4 texts together, you've got a masterpiece on faith, reason, tolerance, and people of faith, the role that religion can play, the constructive role that religion can play in a pluralistic society. Okay, so I think that prediction held up. Third, I said that he's going to come across as a much more positive figure than the early stereotypes would suggest. And I think in the main that's true. You all remember the stereotypes, right? I mean, this was supposed to be God's Rottweiler, you know, the German Shepherd, you know. My favorite expression of those expectations, by the way, there was an editorial cartoon in an Italian newspaper. It's actually the official newspaper of the Communist Party in Italy. One of the charming things about Italy is that no one has bothered to tell them that communism is dead, you know? So the party keeps merrily clunking along, fielding candidates and putting out newspapers and all this other stuff. But anyway, so they had an editorial cartoon the day after Cardinal Ratzinger was elected to the papacy. Now, to get this, you need to know a story about John the 23rd, right? Beloved John the 23rd, good Pope John, the Pope of the Council. This roly-poly Italian peasant who had a heart as big as the world, right? And one of the famous moments, I mean, this is in Italy, this is like the equivalent of 7 years ago, or ask not what your country can do for you. You know, I mean, this is a line that is burned into Italian national consciousness. It's from October 1962, the opening night of Vatican II. There was a torchlit parade that ended up in St. Peter's Square. The Pope was not supposed to speak, but John saw what was going on, and so the windows of the apartment were flung open, and a microphone was produced, and he just started one of these, you know, off the top of his head things for which he was famous. And it ended with this line, okay? I'll give it to you first in Italian, and then I'll translate it. John said, speaking to this crowd, "Stasera, quando tornerete a casa, troverete I vostri bambini. Dateli una carezza. E diteli che questa carezza viene dal Papa." Which means, tonight when you go home, you're going to find your children. Give your children a kiss and tell them that this kiss comes from the Pope. They're just classic, right? All right, so cut to April 20th, 2005, the front page of the communist newspaper in Italy, okay? They've got an editorial cartoon of the new Pope, Papa Ratzinger, standing at the window of the papal apartment looking down on a crowd, and he's saying, "Tonight when you go home, give your children a spanking and tell them that this spanking comes from the Pope." Okay, classic expression of the stereotypes, right? Now, 6 years later, there still is debate, of course, about various aspects of the papacy, but I think most reasonable people would say that the Pope has come off as a much more balanced and a much more positive figure than that early mythology would have suggested. The one place where I think I clearly got it wrong is that I had predicted that Benedict XVI was going to carry out a thorough reform of the Roman Curia. And I wasn't just spitting in the wind. I mean, in 1993, Cardinal Ratzinger went to Rimini, which is where the movement Comunione in Liberazione, Communion and Liberation, has its annual conference. They attract about 700,000 people. And at this Rimini event in 1993, Cardinal Ratzinger gave a speech in which he said, "It is time for a thorough reform of the Roman Curia." He said, "We've had two since the council, and a third one is now in order." And what he had in mind is a lot of stuff. The fact that it is extremely difficult to get the various agencies of the Vatican pulling in the same direction. Each of these offices tends to operate as kind of independent fiefdoms. And communication among them is more accidental than it is systematic. Okay, and the PR problem that we have talked about here today is an index, in many ways, of the need for a thorough reform of the Roman Curia. And because Cardinal Ratzinger had spoken about that, and because he had called for it, he was on record in saying it was time for it. I had thought it would happen. Instead, 6 years into the papacy, it is very clear it has not happened and is not going to happen under this Pope. And I've had this conversation, not with the Pope directly, but with people around him, and here's what I get. What they tell me is that when Benedict was elected, he obviously, understandably, asked himself the question, why would the Holy Spirit put a 78-year-old theologian on the throne of Peter? Okay, what was the providential logic for which I was selected? Given the fact that he's likely to have limited time, at least certainly in comparison to John Paul II. I mean, odds are he's not going to be around as long. And given the fact that at 78 when elected, 84 now, he clearly doesn't have the same energy level that a younger pope might have had. So he asked himself, what's the providential logic for putting me here? And the conclusion that he drew is that he was elected pope to teach. And so that's where his energy and his passion goes. I mean, if you want to know what are the aspects of Benedict's papacy that are nearest and dearest to his heart, where can you find the personal stamp? Because the Vatican, of course, as you know, there's a lot of routine business that the Pope isn't directly involved in. But if you want to know what is the in Benedict's own mind, okay, what does his legacy consist of? I will tell you. It consists of his encyclicals. It consists, those three great encyclicals he's given us so far, Deus Caritas Est, Spe Salvi, and Caritas in Veritate. It consists in the speeches he gives on his foreign trips. It consists in the catechesis he delivers on Wednesday during the general audiences, and in his books. I mean, as you know, this is the first pope to publish a book that he himself has written. I mean, John Paul published books, but they were interview books with journalists. Benedict has actually given us books in his, from his own pen. That's what Benedict believes he was elected to do. That's where his time and energy goes. The conclusion is he believes that he is not going to get distracted by the nuts and bolts of trying to reform the inner workings of the Roman Curia. Now, that is an utterly understandable choice. It also, unfortunately, means that some of the dysfunction that we occasionally see out of the Holy See, including the communications problems we discussed today, I think there is a universal consensus in the Vatican on 2 points. One, they have to be fixed, and two, they're not going to be fixed under this Pope. So I think he's made the decision. This is simply a work for his successor to do. Ladies and gentlemen, I know it's that bewitching hour. Let me say 2 things before you leave. One, if we didn't have time to get to your question, I'll stick around here for a little bit if you want to approach me one-on-one. That's terrific. Second, I want to repeat what I said in my earlier session today. If there is ever any way I can be of help to anyone in this room, I'd be delighted to do that, because I want this to be the beginning of a conversation among us, not the end. Okay? I have an internet column. It's called All Things Catholic. If you just Google All Things Catholic, John Allen, my email address is at the bottom. Feel free to get in touch with me. Now, I have no earthly idea what that might mean. But, you know, reading recommendations, tips on this or that, I mean, as I often say, if you're going to Rome and you want restaurant recommendations, I mean, this is really my forte, okay? Whatever I can do to be of help, because I am profoundly convinced that in Catholic life in the United States in the early 21st century, we have a persistent problem of what I like to call tribalization. That is, as Catholics, we tend to be distributed among various tribes, right? We've got our pro-life Catholics and peace and justice Catholics and neocon Catholics and church reform Catholics and liturgical traditionalist Catholics. And look, in principle, all of that diversity is a very healthy thing. It's tremendously enriching. But when it becomes dysfunctional is when these various tribes stop communicating with one another and instead begin seeing themselves as enemies. And if we take a clear-eyed look around, I think too often that is our situation. The only way to deal with that is to rebuild zones of friendship across those tribal lines. Now, I profoundly believe in that, but if I do, I have to be willing to walk my own talk, okay? So believe me when I tell you, if there is something I can help you with, okay, it's not going to be an imposition on me. It's going to be an opportunity for me to feel like I'm walking my talk. In other words, you're doing me a favor. Okay? So let's keep the conversation going. Thank you.